I read the two Christ books. In your author's notes, you said that it was your belief that the four Gospels had been written before 70 AD.
Right.
Not to badly paraphrase you, but because it was such an event that had they been written after 70, they certainly would have been mentioned in that.
That's right.
I'm not a scholar, I'm not even a deep student, but I've never heard anyone else say that, let me put it that way, and especially about John, which I've heard dated to 100. Could you talk a little bit more about that? What brought you to that statement, that conclusion?
Well, I think the more I studied Scripture and the more I studied the Gospels as literature, which I couldn't help but do as I read them, read them as stories and narratives, the more I felt there were personalities in control of those narratives. Now, we don't really know for sure who they were, and we don't know when they were written. But I sensed a personality, and I sensed some kind of communication between the different gospel writers, different attitudes to things. And it seemed to me, the more I read the history of Jewish literature, the Jewish Bible, all of that, that absolutely, if these had been written after the temple had been destroyed, they would have mentioned it. They would have not failed. They would have punched it hard. They would have punched it hard as saying, look, this is what happened. Jerusalem rejected Christ. The temple was destroyed by the Romans. They would have drawn that out. So they wouldn't have missed that opportunity, because the whole reason for them, for Christianity, was that they were not satisfied with Judaism at that time. They felt something more was needed. And they felt Christ was providing something that the Jewish law had not provided, which is a pretty arrogant thing to believe, I think. But they did believe that. And they wouldn't have failed to mention the fall of the temple. So, and there was another reason why I was sure they were written before the fall of the temple. They contain so many embarrassing and strange things. If they had been written later by a committee of church people, if they had been assembled and edited, they would have been smoothed out. They would have been made to agree with one another. All the embarrassing moments and the strange moments would have been taken out. So all of that conspired to make me feel that they were the work of individual authors, possibly eyewitness, and they were written early. But all of this scholarship, nobody can prove any of that. All you can go by is internal evidence. There really is no external evidence. And the maddening thing about that field is people make pronouncements all the time, as if they had real evidence, and they don't. Until somebody opens a jar out of the desert in Judea with another manuscript in it that upsets everything, we are left with the manuscript evidence we now have, and we're left with internal evidence. It meant a lot to me in writing those books to really immerse myself in all of that material. And it enabled me to really get into those novels and to feel like I was right there in the Second Temple period, and I was right with Jesus' family, and really understood him in that Jewish milieu and as a member of a Jewish family. It was quite an experience writing those two books. It was in some ways the most joyful experience I ever had with writing. Thank you for the question.
Hand right here, down that row.
I'm a social worker, and I work with people who are homeless and living with mental illness. So when I'm reading both your books, I'm also reading through a social work perspective. After you released, I believe it was Memnoch the Devil, you did an interview on Charlie Rose.
I did what?
An interview on Charlie Rose.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And when I saw the interview, I had already read the book. And the book was piercing. And in the interview you said, writing that book nearly killed me.
Yeah.
And when you said that, I wondered, how does working on the dark side of the cosmos so much, does that take a toll on your psyche? And if it does, how do you manage that?
Well, it does take a toll. I mean, I really believe that you have to give everything to a book. And you can nearly die writing that book if you are willing to go all the way with it and not compromise. And over again, I've emerged from writing books in a black depression, almost unable to function. Memnoch the Devil was one, Violin was another. The Vampire Armand was one. I mean, there were any number of books that I came out blackly depressed because I went all the way with my fears. Mainly the basic fear that life is meaningless, that there's nobody in charge. And that fear is something that never leaves me for very long, that we will die without finding out any answers, and we won't have, I used to think when I was young that we would know the answers when we died. That somebody would tap us and say, there are no answers, and you would know, okay, it was meaningless. Then finally it hit me, you're gonna die without anybody telling you one way or the other. You may just stop existing, and you will never know, who was right that day in March when you had that big fight with your husband. You will
That's
never
what it
know.
comes down to?
Well, no, that's just, stop it.
There's the hand. I got the hand, finally.
That's just one aspect of it. I
Right,
mean, you're
right.
never going to know anything.
Right.
And when I pursued that in my books, when I pursue that over and over again, when I get back to all these basic questions, is there any justice really? Is there a loving personality in charge of the cosmos? Maybe there isn't. What do we do? What's right? I mean, how do we live with our guilt? We're all killers. We're all vampires. We're sitting on this stage now while people are dying in other parts of the world. They have nothing to drink, nothing to eat. They're dying of diseases, and we're sitting here. We just ate in a fancy restaurant. We're all killers. We're all murderers. Our hands are bloody. Okay, well, that can drive you crazy.
Welcome to my world, audience.
Anne, you mentioned you had a lot of people who were critical of your writing work. I was wondering if it was the love of writing that kept you going, or if there were particular people who helped you, what got you beyond the criticism and gave you the courage to go forward?
I don't know what gave me the courage to go forward, because I was very sensitive to the criticism, and I was always being set back by it. But there was something ruthless in me that wanted to be a writer, really ruthless. I really just wanted to reach for the stars. I wanted something exciting to happen. And that desperation just kept welling up in me. I just kept writing no matter what anybody said. I wrote a book as a young woman that it never went anywhere. I was shown to a couple of editors, they never responded, nothing ever happened with it. But I just went on. I felt like, okay, I didn't get the intensity I want there. I really didn't do it, I didn't break through. So I just kept trying to do it. And my husband understood this. He understood it very well. He was very different from me, and he had completely different values in terms of literature. He was a poet, and later a painter. But he really could never have written a novel, and certainly he had no respect for the marketplace or wanting to be...
He didn't really read novels. He wasn't a novel
not very
reader.
much.
Yeah.
He did like James Lee Burke.
He did, yeah.
He did, but that was later in life that he would read a novel like that. But he was really... he didn't understand what I was trying to do, all the forces I was trying to bring to bear, but he did respect something in me that wanted to do this, absolutely. So he was very, very supportive. But I think it was really just a ruthlessness in me. And after our daughter died, she died right before her 6th birthday, I remember it was very hard for me to get a job. He had a good job, he was a teacher, and he could make more in a week than I could make in a month. And he said, stay home and write. And that was tremendously encouraging. He said, don't worry about a job, just stay home, I believe in you, just work on your book. That played a huge role, it really did, because I didn't have anything to justify staying home. I felt I should go out and work. I didn't feel that he should support me because he was married to me. And he did say that, and I remember that, and that being and I did write Interview with the Vampire. And then I remember the morning I finished it, I gave it to him. I'd been up all night, and I gave him the manuscript. And I went to sleep, and he woke me up that afternoon, and he said, it's really wonderful. It's really great. And he gave me that invaluable support. But I was very stubborn, and I was very, very desperate, and I might have been able to do it without that, but he certainly gave me invaluable support.
This is for Mrs. Rice. You've been writing, or were writing about sexuality, bisexuality, gay love, long before it became something that was even discussed on television, Will and Grace, all of this stuff that you see now. I've always wondered where that came from, where the interest in that, and for it to connect with so many characters that everybody here loves, but just where that came about, that they were connected in that way that not many mainstream people would have done.
You know, I really don't know the answer to that question, except that when I would start to write, that's what would happen. I would become completely enamored of these characters, and they would move in the direction of transcending gender, and sexuality and sensuality were tremendously important to them. And I believed completely in the goodness and the rightness of that. Nobody was ever able to convince me that sex was bad or that homosexuality was bad or anything like that. And I don't know why that is, because I grew up in a Catholic household, but I grew up in New Orleans, which is a very strangely, wonderfully tolerant city where Catholicism and religion in general are different, really, from the way they are in the rest of the country. It's a city that really just goes completely mad on Mardi Gras. And for 2 weeks before, really, and then everybody gets up on Ash Wednesday and goes to church and gets ashes on their forehead. But there was a wonderful milieu to grow up in, and I remember my mother being extremely tolerant and extremely understanding about all things that pertain to sex, and it being extremely loving and being very open on that subject. But why a writer writes about that, say, as opposed to something else, I really don't know. It was something that I simply couldn't keep out of my work. My characters loved one another, whether they were two men, two women, a man and a woman, a man and woman and child, whatever. It's been described by friends and critics as polymorphous sexuality sometime in the Vampire Chronicles. But whatever it is, I stuck with it, and that's where I find the feeling of authenticity. So, thank heaven, I was able to make it feel pretty authentic for readers as well. But I don't know why I'm as obsessed with it. I think I'm very angry at religion for the way it treats gay people. I'm very deeply angry at religion for the way it treats sexuality in general. And that comes out in me creating an ideal world or a better world in which my characters don't suffer because of those things. They go forward,